It starts with a simple request to switch seats, but within an hour, that request escalates into a full-blown confrontation at 30,000 feet. You're about to hear the story of Dr. Saraphina Washington, a brilliant black woman who was publicly humiliated and forcibly removed from her first-class seat. They thought she was just another passenger they could bully into submission. But they were wrong. Because what happened in the next 10 minutes would not only ground that flight, but would send a shockwave through the entire airline industry, proving that sometimes the quietest person in the room holds all the power. The air in the first-class cabin of Ascend Air Flight 715 from New York to London was a carefully curated illusion of tranquility. The scent of warm towels and something vaguely floral hung in the recycled atmosphere. The gentle hum of the Rolls-Royce Trent 900 engines was a promise of progress, a lullaby for the privileged, for Dr. Saraphina Washington. It was simply white noise. She settled into seat 2B, a window seat she had specifically booked months in advance. It was her ritual, the ascent through the clouds. The view of the world shrinking below was a meditative experience that helped her decompress before a week of intense work. At 52, Saraphina carried an aura of quiet authority. Her salt and pepper hair was styled in intricate locks that cascaded over the collar of her bespoke charcoal grey blazer. Her face, framed by simple pearl earrings, was one that conveyed deep thought and a placid, almost unnerving calmness. She was not a woman given to frivolous gestures or loud pronouncements. Her power was in her stillness, in the sharp intelligence of her dark eyes that seemed to analyze everything from the structural integrity of the fuselage to the subtle social dynamics of the cabin. She had just placed her noise-cancelling headphones over her ears, ready to retreat into a Brahms symphony, when a shadow fell over her. "Excuse me," a voice said, clipped and impatient. Saraphina looked up. A man who looked to be in his late 30s stood in the aisle, his face a mask of harried entitlement. He was dressed in a suit that was likely expensive, but looked rumpled as if he'd been living in it for a day too long. He gestured vaguely towards his seat, 3C, and then to the seat next to Saraphina 2A, where a young woman was already settling in. "My colleague and I need to discuss our presentation," he said, not asking but informing. "You'll need to move." Saraphina paused the music. She looked at the man, then at her boarding pass resting on the small console, then back at him. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice even and calm. "But this is my assigned seat." "Yes, I see that." The man, who she would later learn was named Chadwick Sterling, huffed. "But we need to work. We have a multi-million-dollar merger on the line. I'm sure you can understand." He glanced around as if expecting the other passengers to nod in agreement with his self-importance. The young woman in 2A, his colleague, looked mortified. "Chad, it's fine, we can just—" "No, Ashley, it's not fine." He cut her off. "We need the space. The lady can move to my seat." He gestured back to 3C, a middle seat in the row behind. Saraphina maintained her composure. "I specifically chose this seat, sir. I'm afraid I'm not going to move." Chadwick's face began to flush. "Look, I don't think you understand. This is important. My comfort and my plans are also important to me." Saraphina replied, her tone unwavering. The simple factual nature of her statement seemed to enrage him more than any overt aggression could have. It was a dismissal of his assumed priority. It was then that the flight attendant appeared. Her name tag read Brenda. She was a woman in her late 40s, with a strained smile plastered on her face, the kind that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. She immediately focused on Chadwick, her expression one of solicitous concern. "Is there a problem here, sir?" she asked, her voice dripping with practiced sweetness. "Yes," Chadwick said, pointing a thumb at Saraphina. "This woman is refusing to switch seats so I can work with my colleague. I have a middle seat back there. It's completely unreasonable." Brenda turned her gaze to Saraphina, and the sweetness curdled slightly. The smile remained, but it became a tool of condescension. "Ma'am," she began, her tone shifting to one you might use with a confused child. "This gentleman and his colleague have some very important work to do. It would be a great help if you could just swap with him. It's just for the flight." Saraphina felt a familiar, weary tightening in her chest. She had encountered 1,000 Brendas in her life. Women who saw her skin color before they saw her, who made assumptions based on a lifetime of ingrained biases. They saw a black woman and assumed she was out of place in first class, that her presence was a fluke, a ticket won in a raffle perhaps. They certainly didn't see a woman who held a PhD in aeronautical engineering from MIT, a woman who had designed the very winglets on this Airbus A380 that helped it fly more efficiently. "I am also a paying passenger in my assigned seat," Saraphina stated clearly. "I chose it for a reason, and I am not moving. The gentleman can feel free to ask his colleague to swap with him if they need to be adjacent." Brenda's smile finally faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "Ma'am, we really don't want to cause a scene." It was a classic deflection. Saraphina was sitting quietly, being asked to give up her seat. Chadwick was the one causing the scene. Yet Saraphina was being painted as the difficult one. "I have no intention of causing a scene," Saraphina replied, turning her gaze back toward the window, a clear signal that the conversation was over. "I simply want to enjoy the seat that I paid for." This was an unacceptable challenge to Brenda's authority. She saw a black woman defying her, not shouting, not cursing, but calmly and immovably defying her. It was in Brenda's world the ultimate transgression. She exchanged a look with Chadwick, a moment of silent, ugly alliance. "I'm going to have to ask you to reconsider," Brenda said, her voice now firm and laced with a threat. "If you're not willing to be cooperative, I may have to get the Perser." "Please do," Saraphina said, without looking back at her. The Perser, a man named Jeffrey, arrived a few minutes later. Brenda had clearly given him her heavily biased version of events. His face was a stern, officious mask. "Ma'am," Jeffrey said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear, "I am the head purser on this flight. I understand you are being disruptive and refusing to follow a flight attendant's instructions." The word disruptive hung in the air, a deliberate and poisonous choice. Saraphina slowly turned to face him. Her calmness was beginning to unnerve them, to make them escalate their own behavior. "I have not been disruptive," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I was asked to give up my seat. I declined. That is all that has occurred. Your flight attendant is misrepresenting the situation." "Brenda is one of our most experienced crew members," Jeffrey said dismissively. "Now, are you going to move to the other seat, or is this going to be a problem?" The plane had finished boarding, and the cabin door was about to close. The threat was implicit comply, or you won't be flying at all. Saraphina looked at the faces around her. Chadwick Sterling was smirking. A few other passengers looked uncomfortable, but were pointedly staring at their phones, unwilling to get involved. Others, however, wore expressions of faint, smug approval. They saw the scene exactly as Brenda and Jeffrey were framing it, an unruly passenger being put in her place. Saraphina made a decision. This was no longer about a seat. It was about a principle. It was about the casual, systemic disrespect she had endured in countless small ways throughout her entire life and career. "No," she said. "This is not going to be a problem for me, because I am not moving. You are creating the problem, and I would advise you to think very carefully about your next step." Her words, delivered with such steely conviction, gave Jeffrey pause. But he had already committed. Backing down now would be a loss of face. He glanced at Brenda, who gave him a sharp, encouraging nod. "All right," Jeffrey said, his jaw tight. "I'm calling the captain." The arrival of Captain Robert Miller was an exercise in theatrical authority. He strode into the first-class cabin with an air of command, his crisp white shirt and epaulets gleaming under the soft cabin lighting. He was in his 50s, with a weathered face and a gaze accustomed to scanning distant horizons, not settling petty passenger disputes. His presence silenced the remaining whispers in the cabin. All eyes were on the unfolding drama. He didn't speak to Saraphina first. He conferred in a hushed, urgent huddle with Jeffrey and Brenda near the galley. Saraphina watched them, her expression unreadable. She could see Brenda gesturing animatedly, her face a pantomime of distress and indignation. She could see Jeffrey nodding gravely, reinforcing the narrative. She could see Chadwick Sterling leaning into the aisle, adding his own 2 cents with a look of profound victimhood. It was a kangaroo court, conducted in whispers and glances, and the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Captain Miller finally turned and walked towards her. He stopped at her row, his large frame blocking the aisle. He did not make eye contact. He looked at a point just above her head, as if addressing the fuselage itself. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low baritone that carried an unmistakable note of finality. "I am Captain Miller, and I am the commander of this aircraft. My crew has informed me that you have been causing a disturbance and refusing to comply with their instructions. This behavior poses a potential safety risk on my flight." The accusation was breathtaking in its absurdity. A safety risk. For politely declining to move seats, Saraphina felt a cold, clear anger solidifying within her. It was not a hot, reckless rage, but a focused, crystalline fury. She had spent 30 years of her life dedicated to aviation safety. She had written protocols, designed systems, and testified before congressional committees on the very subject. To have her own life's work twisted into a weapon against her was an insult of the highest order. "Captain," she said, and her voice was so perfectly modulated, so devoid of the emotion he clearly expected, that it made him finally meet her eyes. "With all due respect, your crew is either lying or grossly incompetent. I have done nothing but sit in my assigned seat and read a book. The disturbance is being caused by a passenger who felt entitled to my seat, and by your crew who have chosen to escalate a simple matter into this performance." Her choice of the word performance was deliberate. It hit its mark. A muscle twitched in Captain Miller's jaw. "My crew's judgment is not in question here," he stated, his voice hardening. "This is my aircraft, and my word is final. Federal law grants me the authority to refuse transport to any passenger who threatens the safety and security of the flight. I have made a determination that you are such a passenger." The sheer, unmitigated gall of it left Saraphina momentarily speechless. He was invoking federal law, the very body of regulations she had helped to shape to justify an act of petty tyranny fueled by racial bias. "So to be clear," she said, her voice lethally soft, "you are ejecting a passenger from a flight because she refused to give up her pre-selected paid-for seat. Is that the official reason you will be logging in your report?" "I'm ejecting a non-compliant passenger," he retorted, his eyes flashing with anger. "That's all the report will need to say. Now you have 2 options. You can gather your belongings and deplane voluntarily, or I can have airport security escort you off. I assure you the second option will be far more unpleasant and will come with additional consequences." A collective gasp went through the cabin. It had come to this. A woman was about to be forcibly removed from a plane. Saraphina looked at Chadwick Sterling. The smirk on his face was one of pure triumphant vindication. He had won. He had used the system with its inherent biases to get exactly what he wanted. Brenda stood behind the captain, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of stern professional concern that looked utterly false. Saraphina's gaze swept over the other faces. She saw the uncomfortable ones, who were now staring resolutely out the windows at the ceiling anywhere but at her. Their silence was complicity. They wanted the drama to be over so their flight could leave. They were willing to witness an injustice to avoid a minor inconvenience. Then she saw Ashley Chadwick's young colleague in seat 2A. The woman was pale, her eyes wide with horror. She looked like she wanted to speak to object, but she was trapped by her own fear, by the power her boss held over her. Saraphina held the young woman's gaze for a moment. In that silent exchange, Saraphina wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting against the Chadwicks and Brendas of the world, and for all the Ashleys who were too afraid to. Slowly, deliberately, Saraphina began to gather her things. She did not rush. She folded her blazer with meticulous care. She unplugged her headphones and wound the cord into a perfect circle. She slipped her tablet into its leather case. Every movement was precise, graceful, and utterly devoid of panic. She was communicating with her body language. "You have not broken me. You have not rattled me." 2 airport security officers, burly men with impassive faces, had appeared at the cabin door. Their presence was the final humiliating touch. Captain Miller stood back to let her pass. As she stepped into the aisle, she paused and looked directly at him. "Captain Miller," she said, her voice just loud enough for him and the first few rows to hear. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, and I promise you will regret it before your plane ever leaves the ground." The captain just scoffed a dismissive little sound. "Have a nice day, ma'am." As Saraphina walked the length of the first-class cabin, escorted by the 2 officers, she could feel the weight of every stare. It was a walk of shame they had orchestrated for her. But as she passed Chadwick Sterling, she didn't even grant him a glance. He was a symptom, not the disease. Her focus was on the larger mechanism of which he was just a petty grinding gear. She stepped out of the aircraft and onto the jet bridge. The door to Flight 715 hissed shut behind her, a sound of definitive finality. The engines were spooling up, preparing for departure. The injustice was complete. She was left on the outside, looking in. But they had all made one critical, world-altering miscalculation. They assumed her power lay inside that airplane. They had no idea that her true power was about to be unleashed out here on the tarmac. The air on the jet bridge was stale and cool. Saraphina stood for a moment, flanked by the 2 security officers, who now seemed unsure of their role. The immediate threat was gone. She was compliant. They were just glorified ushers in a play that had reached its conclusion, or so they thought. "This way, ma'am," one of them said, gesturing towards the terminal. Saraphina held up a hand. "One moment, please." She reached into her handbag and pulled out her phone. It was a simple standard-issue device, but to her it was an instrument of immense power. She ignored the dozens of notifications that had piled up and went straight to her contacts. She scrolled past names that would have made aviation executives tremble. Senators, FAA, administrators, CEOs of aerospace manufacturing giants. She stopped at a name listed simply as Marcus T. She pressed the call button. As the phone rang, she turned her head slightly and looked through the thick glass of the jet bridge window. She could see the cockpit of the Airbus A380 Captain Robert Miller, a silhouette against the glowing instrument panels. He was likely going through his final pre-flight checklist, confident that the disruptive passenger was now just a bad memory, a forgotten anecdote. "This is Thorne," a deep, no-nonsense voice answered on the first ring. "Marcus, it's Saraphina, Washington," she said, her voice as calm as if she were inquiring about the weather. There was a subtle shift in the tone on the other end of the line. "Sarah, I thought you were in the air by now. Everything all right with the departure of the new A-Wing?" Marcus Thorne was the director of operations for the entire John F. Kennedy International Airport. He was a man who commanded an army of air traffic controllers, ground crew, and emergency services. He was also her former protégé, a brilliant logistician she had mentored years ago at the FAA. They trusted each other implicitly. "Not exactly," Saraphina said, her gaze still fixed on Flight 715. "I'm calling to report a Level 1 safety protocol breach at Gate C-34. The aircraft in question is Ascend Air 715, service to Heathrow." There was a dead silence on the line. A Level 1 breach was the highest possible alert. It signified a direct and immediate threat to operational safety, the kind of event that grounded fleets and launched federal investigations. "Level 1. Marcus repeated, his voice now stripped of all pleasantries. "Saraphina, what are you seeing? Is it a mechanical fault? A security threat?" "The threat," Saraphina said. Letting a sliver of ice enter her tone, "is in the cockpit. I have just been personally ejected from that flight by the Captain Robert Miller." "He what?" The shock in Marcus's voice was palpable. "On what grounds?" "The stated grounds were that I was a non-compliant passenger posing a safety risk," she explained. "The actual grounds were that I, a black woman in seat 2B, refused to give up my seat to a white male passenger. The crew, specifically, a flight attendant named Brenda Jenkins and a purser named Jeffrey, escalated the situation, misrepresented the facts to the captain, and he, without performing any due diligence or basic crew resource management, summarily removed me from the plane." She paused, letting the full weight of the situation land. Marcus, the captain, and his senior crew have demonstrated a complete failure of situational awareness, de-escalation protocol, and sound judgment. The protocol they violated wasn't just some airline guideline. It was Section 4, Paragraph 7B of the Comprehensive Aircrew Management and Threat Assessment Directive. The one I wrote, and that the FAA made mandatory for all domestic and international carriers operating out of newly certified terminals. She let that last part hang in the air. She wasn't just an expert. She was the expert, the architect of the very rules they had just broken. Marcus Thorne swore a sharp, violent curse. He understood instantly. This wasn't a passenger dispute anymore. This was a critical failure of a federally mandated safety system. A crew that could act this rashly and unprofessionally over a seat assignment could not be trusted to handle a genuine in-flight emergency. "Saraphina," Marcus said, his voice now cold and hard as steel. "Where are you right now?" "I'm still on the jet bridge at Gate C-34. They're about to push back." Through the window, she could see the ground crew disconnecting the umbilical cords of power and air. The tug was moving into position. "They're not going anywhere," Marcus stated flatly. "I am issuing a gate hold and a tarmac stop on Ascend 715, effective immediately. I'm citing a critical command crew review. No one talks to that crew until my incident team gets there. No one." Saraphina watched as she spoke. She saw the flashing yellow lights of an airport operations vehicle suddenly appear near the nose of the giant plane. Then another. The tug which had been about to connect to the nose gear abruptly stopped and backed away. A man in a high-visibility jacket was gesticulating wildly at the cockpit. "I see your handiwork, Marcus," she said. "This is not my handiwork, Saraphina. This is your authority. You are the lead FAA auditor for this terminal's certification. A report of a Level 1 breach from you is as good as a direct order from God as far as I'm concerned. You have, for all intents and purposes, just shut down that flight." He paused. "And you know what this means for the new A-Wing, don't you?" "I do," she said grimly. The A-Wing was the airport's brand-new multi-billion-dollar international terminal, a source of immense civic and commercial pride. Ascend Air was its flagship tenant. If Ascend Air's command crews are not compliant with the safety directives you personally certified, then the entire wing's operational certificate is in jeopardy, Marcus said. "You haven't just shut down a flight, Sarah. You may have just shut down the entire runway system associated with this terminal." The two security officers standing beside her were now looking at her with wide, confused eyes. They had heard her end of the conversation. They saw the flashing lights on the tarmac. They saw the A380, which should have been rolling majestically towards the runway, sitting inert and silent at the gate. They had escorted a passenger off a plane. 10 minutes later, that same passenger had, with a single phone call, brought one of the world's busiest airports to a grinding halt. The woman they had treated as a problem was in fact the one who held all the cards. The game had just changed, and the real power had finally been revealed. Inside the cockpit of Flight 715, Captain Robert Miller was seething. The gate hold notification had crackled over his radio, sharp and unequivocal. "Ascend 715, hold position at the gate. I repeat, hold position. Tarmac stop is in effect. Await instructions." "What the hell is this?" he muttered to his first officer, a younger man named David. "We're already 10 minutes behind schedule thanks to that woman." David shrugged his eyes, scanning the instruments. "Could be anything. Ground traffic, runway congestion." But then the specific instruction came through, and it sent a chill through the cockpit. "Ascend 715. The tarmac stop is for your flight only. The order is from Airport Operations Command. The reason cited is a critical command crew review." Robert Miller felt the blood drain from his face. Command crew review. Those were words no captain ever wanted to hear, especially not when he was buttoned up and ready for pushback. It meant one thing: his authority, his decision-making, was being officially questioned. "What review?" he snapped into his microphone. "Who ordered it?" "We have no issues on this aircraft." "Stand by, Captain," the disembodied voice from the tower replied, offering no comfort. He looked out the cockpit window. The flashing lights of the operations vehicles were like strobing accusations. The jet bridge, which should have been retracting, remained stubbornly attached to his plane. Then he saw them. A group of people in dark suits, walking purposefully down that jet bridge, led by a man he recognized with a jolt of alarm. Marcus Thorne, the airport's formidable director of operations. And walking calmly beside Thorne, her expression serene and unreadable, was the woman. The black woman he had just thrown off his plane. A sick, sinking feeling began to pool in Captain Miller's stomach. This was not standard procedure. This was something else entirely. The knock on the cockpit door was sharp and authoritative. David, the first officer, opened it. Jeffrey the purser stood there, his face pale and sweating. Behind him stood Marcus Thorne and Dr. Saraphina Washington. "Captain Miller." Marcus said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute command. "We need to have a word. In the cabin." In the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was thick with confusion and anxiety. The passengers who had been celebrating their imminent departure were now murmuring nervously. They saw the official-looking men, and most terrifyingly, they saw the return of the woman who had been escorted off. She wasn't in handcuffs. She was walking side by side with the man who was clearly in charge of the entire airport. Chadwick Sterling stared, his mouth slightly agape. The smirk had vanished, replaced by a dawning horror. Brenda, the flight attendant, who had been preening with self-satisfaction in the galley, froze solid, a coffee pot, held halfway to a cup. Captain Miller, followed by Jeffrey, stepped out of the cockpit. The four of them, Miller, Thorne, Jeffrey, and Saraphina, stood in the small space near the forward galley. Marcus Thorne wasted no time. "Captain Miller, my name is Marcus Thorne, Director of Airport Operations. This is Dr. Saraphina Washington. I believe you've met." Miller nodded stiffly, his eyes darting towards Saraphina. He was still trying to process how she had managed this. "Dr. Washington," Thorne continued, his voice resonating through the silent cabin, "is the lead FAA safety auditor for the certification of this new terminal. She is also the principal author of the Comprehensive Aircrew Management and Threat Assessment Directive, which is a mandatory federal requirement for all airlines operating from this wing." A collective audible gasp rippled through the passengers. Chadwick Sterling looked like he had been punched in the gut. Brenda's face went from pale to ashen. "Dr. Washington has just invoked Section 4, Paragraph 7b of that directive," Thorne said, his gaze boring into Captain Miller. "She has filed a Level 1 report against you and your senior crew, citing a catastrophic failure in judgment and a complete disregard for mandated de-escalation and assessment protocols. Captain, she alleges that you removed a federally credentialed safety auditor from your aircraft under the guise of a security threat, when in fact it was a dispute over a passenger's seat." Miller was speechless. He felt like the floor was falling out from beneath him. He looked at Brenda and Jeffrey, whose panicked expressions offered no defense. They had fed him a story, and he in his arrogance and haste had swallowed it whole. He had not questioned them. He had not spoken to the other passenger. He had simply acted asserting an authority he now realized he had completely misused. "Based on Dr. Washington's official report," Thorne declared, his voice rising so everyone could hear, "I have no choice. Ascend Air Flight 715 is grounded indefinitely, pending a full investigation by my office and the Federal Aviation Administration. Your entire crew will be escorted to my operations center for immediate interviews. This aircraft will not be going to London. Not tonight, and not with you in command." The finality of his words was absolute. He then turned his attention to Brenda and Jeffrey. "As for you two," he said, his voice laced with contempt, "your airline may deal with you later. But right now, your airport access credentials are being revoked. You will be escorted from the premises." He then looked past them, his eyes finding a stunned Chadwick Sterling in his seat. Seat 2B, Saraphina's seat. "Sir," Thorne said, pointing a finger at him, "you were the instigator of this incident. You will also be required to give a statement. I suggest you find a very good lawyer." Saraphina stood by watching it all unfold. She felt no triumph, no glee, just a profound, aching sadness. It had all been so unnecessary. A simple matter of human decency could have avoided all of this. But the system and the people within it had failed that simple test. She made eye contact with Ashley, the young colleague. The woman looked at Saraphina with an expression of awe and, strangely, gratitude. As airport officials began the process of deplaning the bewildered passengers and sequestering the crew, Saraphina turned to Marcus. "The runway, Marcus?" she asked quietly. "For now it's just this flight and this gate," he replied, "but I've already put a call in to the regional FAA administrator. Ascend Air's entire operational plan for this terminal is under review as of right now. They'll have to prove every single one of their crews is compliant with your directive before another one of their planes takes off from this wing. You didn't just ground a flight, Sarah. You fired a shot across the bow of their entire international operation." She nodded slowly. The consequences were already spiraling outwards, far beyond the confines of this single airplane. The karma wasn't just coming. It had arrived with the force of a hurricane. The hours that followed were a masterclass in bureaucratic dismantling. While the disgruntled passengers of Flight 715 were being rerouted, rebooked, or sent to hotels, the key players in the drama were escorted to the sterile, windowless heart of JFK's Operations Command Center. The atmosphere was frigid, both literally and figuratively. Dr. Saraphina Washington was given a quiet office, a courtesy extended to a high-ranking federal partner. She sat not as a victim, but as the primary witness and complainant. She wrote her statement with the same meticulous precision she applied to everything, detailing every word, every gesture, every nuance of the encounter. She was not emotional. She was factual, her report, a damning indictment built on the unshakable foundation of the truth. In separate interrogation rooms, the unraveling began. Brenda Jenkins, the flight attendant, was the first to crack. Stripped of her uniform and the flimsy authority it provided, she was just a tired, scared woman. Faced with two grim-faced investigators from the FAA and the Port Authority, her carefully constructed narrative crumbled. I was just trying to maintain order," she stammered, twisting a tissue in her hands. The man, Mr. Sterling, was very insistent. He said his meeting was critical. Was Dr. Washington being loud, threatening, or abusive in any way? One investigator asked, his pen poised over a notepad. "Well, no, not loud, but she was stubborn," Brenda offered weakly. "She was being uncooperative." "Uncooperative with what, Ms. Jenkins?" the second investigator pressed. "An unofficial request from another passenger. Is it Ascend Air's policy to force passengers to relinquish their paid assigned seats to accommodate the wishes of another? No, but you have to know how to read a situation. I was trying to de-escalate. It seems to us and to Dr. Washington that you did the exact opposite," the first investigator said flatly. "You escalated. You brought in the Perser. You mischaracterized a passenger's calm refusal as disruption. You poisoned the well before the captain ever arrived. Is that not what happened?" Brenda began to cry. They were not tears of remorse, but tears of self-pity. "My career. I've been flying for 25 years. Perhaps you should have considered that before you chose to single out and humiliate a passenger," was the unsympathetic reply. Jeffrey the purser tried a different tactic. He attempted to hide behind procedure and a wall of officious jargon. "I was acting on the information provided by my subordinate. My role was to support my crew and ensure the captain was properly briefed." "Did you at any point speak directly to Dr. Washington to get her side of the story?" an investigator asked. "Did you attempt your own assessment of the situation before engaging the captain?" Jeffrey shifted in his chair. Events were moving quickly. Brenda was adamant that the passenger was becoming a point of conflict. So you took the word of one flight attendant over a seated, quiet passenger and recommended involving the captain on the grounds of a disturbance. Yes, I backed my crew. You backed a lie, the investigator corrected him. And in doing so, you bypassed at least 4 distinct steps in the very conflict resolution protocol Dr. Washington herself designed. You didn't just back your crew, Mr. Jones. You violated federal safety regulations. The Perser's confident facade evaporated. He, like Brenda, saw his career flashing before his eyes. Their combined testimony painted a clear picture, a snap judgment fueled by implicit bias that snowballed into a crisis through sheer incompetence and a refusal to listen. The most intense interview was with Captain Robert Miller. He sat opposite Marcus Thorne and a senior FAA official who had been scrambled to the airport. Miller had his union representative with him, but the man could do little more than ensure the coffee was fresh. The evidence was overwhelming. "I want you to walk me through it, Bob," the FAA official, a man named Henderson, said grimly. "From the moment you were called to the cabin." Miller, his voice hoarse, recounted the events from his perspective. The briefing from Jeffrey and Brenda, the portrayal of the unruly passenger, his decision to act decisively to ensure the safety of the flight. "Did you speak to anyone else?" Marcus Thorne asked. "Did you notice the passenger in 2A, the instigator's colleague, who by all accounts looked horrified by her boss's behavior? Did you ask her what happened?" "No," Miller admitted. "Did you look at Dr. Washington?" Henderson pressed. "Did she appear intoxicated, agitated, or physically threatening in any way?" "No, she was calm." "She was calm," Henderson repeated, letting the words sink in. "A calm woman sitting in her seat was deemed a security threat by you." "Why?" Miller had no good answer. "My crew. They felt. Your crew felt." Henderson cut him off, his voice rising in anger. "A captain doesn't feel. A captain assesses. A captain leads. You are given absolute authority on that aircraft, Bob, and with that comes absolute responsibility. You are the final backstop against foolishness. But you didn't backstop it. You rubber-stamped it. You took the path of least resistance, and in doing so you broke the law and jeopardized the operational integrity of your airline." Miller slumped in his chair, the full weight of his failure crushing him. The pride he had carried for 30 years as a pilot, the image of himself as a decisive commander, was shattered. He was just a man who had been too arrogant to ask a simple question. Finally, there was Chadwick Sterling. He had arrived at the command center full of bluster-threatening lawsuits and complaining about his ruined schedule. His tone changed abruptly when he was informed that he was being interviewed as part of a federal investigation and that his company, a major financial firm, would be officially notified of his role in instigating an incident that had grounded an international flight and triggered a multi-agency review. His lawyer, hastily summoned, advised him to tell the truth. Chadwick's statement was a pathetic litany of self-importance and entitlement. "I just needed the seat," he said. "The presentation was worth millions. I didn't think it would be a big deal for her to move." "A big deal for her?" an investigator asked pointedly. Chadwick had the decency to flush. For the passenger." He left the command center a changed man. The bluster was gone, replaced by the cold, clammy fear of someone who has just realized they have made a very public, very expensive mistake. The world he inhabited, one where his whims were catered to, had just collided violently with a world of rules, consequences, and women who wrote those rules. As the sun began to rise over the quiet runways of the A-Wing, the initial phase of the investigation was complete. The stories were all recorded. The evidence was clear. and the stage was set for the karma to be delivered. The consequences of the Ascend Air Flight 715 incident did not simply arrive. They cascaded. What began as a single ugly act of prejudice in a first-class cabin metastasized into a corporate plague, a multi-pronged assault of financial ruin, public disgrace, and personal annihilation. For those who had wronged Dr. Saraphina Washington, the universe did not just settle the score. It burned the entire ledger and started anew, leaving them buried in the ashes. The harvest was not merely bitter, it was absolute. The initial shockwave hit JFK with the force of a physical impact. The grounding of a single A380 was a logistical headache. The grounding of Ascend Air's entire A-wing operation was a declaration of war by the FAA, with Saraphina as its commanding general. The pristine billion-dollar terminal became a ghost town of Ascend Air gates. Frantic gate agents faced a rising tide of furious passengers, their destinations London-Paris. Tokyo suddenly as unreachable as the moon. The cost was astronomical. Each grounded super jumbo jet bled hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour in fuel, parking fees, crew salaries, and the cascading nightmare of passenger compensation. The news, initially confined to airport gossip, exploded into the public sphere. A passenger on the flight, a tech blogger who had witnessed the whole exchange, had discreetly filmed Saraphina's calm, steely defiance and Captain Miller's arrogant dismissal. The video, uploaded with the title "Class Act versus Classless Crew," went hyper-viral. By morning, #Juan Fly Right and #Justice. For to Washington were the top trending topics globally. Major news networks broke into regular programming. The narrative was irresistible. A calm, professional black woman, a titan in her field, humiliated by a petty crew and a pompous captain, only to reveal her true power and bring an entire airline to its knees. In a glass-walled boardroom in Chicago, Ascend Air's CEO Richard Branson presided over the bloodletting. Furious board members watching billions in market capitalization evaporate demanded scalps. The stock had nosedived a vertiginous plunge driven by pure, unadulterated public outrage. Their brand, once associated with luxury and prestige, was now a meme for corporate racism and incompetence. Branson's first move was a desperate, groveling phone call to Dr. Washington. He found her not in a lawyer's office, but in her own, overlooking the very runways she had helped design. "Dr. Washington," he began, his voice oozing a practiced, insincere contrition. "On behalf of the entire Ascend Air family, I want to extend our most profound and sincere apologies." Saraphina cut him off, her voice devoid of heat but sharp as surgical steel. "Mr. Branson, save the platitudes for your press release. Your family has a systemic disease. What I experienced was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a rotten corporate culture that you have allowed to fester. Do not apologize to me. Fix your company." The ultimate humiliation came a week later. The FAA, with Marcus Thorne acting as its unflinching enforcer, made its terms for recertification clear. Ascend Air would be permitted to resume full operations only after its entire command level and cabin crew staff globally underwent a complete retraining in crew resource management, de-escalation, and implicit bias awareness. And the firm contracted to design, oversee, and personally sign off on this mandatory fleet-wide program would be none other than the Washington Aeronautical Consultancy Group. Dr. Saraphina Washington was now in the position of charging her tormentors an exorbitant fee to teach them the decency and professionalism they should have possessed in the first place. It was the most elegant and financially devastating checkmate imaginable. For the individuals who had lit the fuse, The consequences were intimate and life-altering. Brenda Jenkins was summoned to a sterile HR office at Ascend's JFK hub. She walked in expecting a reprimand, perhaps a suspension. She still saw herself as the victim, a loyal employee, trying to manage a difficult situation. She was fired in under 3 minutes. Her 25 years of service were dismissed as irrelevant. The viral video had made her face recognizable, the symbol of a flight attendant on a power trip. The union couldn't protect her. She was too toxic a liability in a uniform. She lost her job, her full pension, and the travel benefits that had been the singular perk of a grueling career. She was cast out unemployable in the only industry she knew, forever haunted by the quiet, dignified face of the woman she had so casually tried to break. Jeffrey Jones, the purser, believed his seniority would shield him. He was a manager. In his termination meeting, he made the fatal mistake of trying to blame Brenda. "I was acting on the information from my subordinate," he argued, attempting to wrap himself in the cloak of procedure. The HR executive slid a copy of the investigation report across the table. It detailed in excruciating detail how Jeffrey had not followed a single de-escalation protocol, how his role as a leader was to assess, not to amplify. His failure was deemed worse than Brenda's. Her sin was one of prejudice. His was a complete abdication of leadership. He too was terminated, his career ending not with a retirement party, but with a security guard escorting him to the employee parking lot. The fall of Captain Robert Miller was the most profound. As a pilot, he was protected by the most powerful union in the industry, which saved him from immediate termination. But they could not save him from the FAA or from himself. His license was suspended, pending a full psychiatric and professional competency review. The Critical Command Crew Review was a permanent, damning stain on his record. His retraining was a special kind of hell. This proud veteran, who had once commanded the world's largest passenger aircraft, found himself in a classroom in Oklahoma City, being lectured by a 28-year-old psychologist on microaggressions in confined spaces. The other pilots, once his peers, now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He had broken the cardinal rule. He had let a cabin dispute compromise the integrity of the flight deck. He had failed to lead. The arrogance that had defined him curdled into a corrosive shame. Ascend Air, desperate to sever all ties, eventually forced him into an early retirement. He left the skies forever, a grounded king, forever haunted by the memory of the one passenger he should never have challenged. For Chadwick Sterling, the karma was swift, public, and deliciously ironic. His name, unredacted in a leaked copy of the FAA's initial report, became intrinsically linked to the viral story. His employer, the prestigious investment bank Morgan Stern, was mortified. Their carefully crafted image as a progressive, inclusive firm was being torched online by the actions of one entitled vice president. The European tech firm whose merger he was flying to London to secure immediately cancelled the final negotiations. Their CEO sent a one-sentence email to Morgan Stern's chairman. "We cannot build a future with a partner whose senior leadership displays such a profound lack of character." The deal, worth hundreds of millions, evaporated because Chad couldn't handle sitting in a middle seat. His firing was a work of cold corporate art. He was called into a meeting with the head of HR and the firm's chief counsel. There was no discussion. It was a statement. He had violated the company's code of conduct, brought the firm into public disrepute, and caused catastrophic financial and reputational damage. He was a liability. His security badge was deactivated mid-meeting. His access to the company servers was cut. By the time he took the elevator down to the lobby, his name had already been removed from the company directory. And in a final perfect twist of fate, the firm, in a desperate act of damage control, needed to show they were serious about change. They reviewed the file. They saw that Ashley, his junior colleague, had given a truthful, damning statement against him. A week later, she was promoted, given a corner office, and assigned to lead the team, salvaging what was left of the European relationship. She inherited the very power and position that Chadwick had thrown away in a single pathetic fit of pique. He had demanded a seat, and in the end, had lost everything. So what's the real lesson here? This story isn't just about a single flight or one woman's incredible moment of turning the tables. It's a powerful reminder that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. And judging someone based on their appearance, their gender, or the color of their skin is a fool's game, because you never ever know who you're dealing with. Dr. Saraphina Washington wasn't looking for a fight, but when one was brought to her, she used her power not for petty revenge, but to enforce the very standards of safety and professionalism she had dedicated her life to building. She reminded an entire industry that integrity is not optional. The world is full of Brendas and Chadwicks, people who use their small pockets of authority to belittle others. But it's also full of Saraphinas, quiet, brilliant forces for change. This story shows that karma isn't just a mystical force. Sometimes it's a meticulously documented report, a federal regulation, and a phone call to the right person. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in standing up to injustice, then please help us share it. Hit that like button so more people can see this. Share this video with your friends and family. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more true stories of incredible people and unforgettable moments of justice. Let us know in the comments below, what would you have done in Dr. Washington's shoes?